Welcome everybody to the first in a series of private events we're hosting this year. My name is Trey Alter. I'm the CEO of Dynamark Monitoring, and presumably if you're here today, you have a pretty good idea of who we are, and hopefully you share our passion for this industry. I'm pleased to have Dr. Basu here today. Finally, I get to host instead of attend one of these events. I've seen Dr. Basu probably a half a dozen times over the last 15 years. And I've always really enjoyed the presentations. And we strongly believe that the success of our industry is closely tied to, a lot of other factors that we don't think about every day, whether it's capital markets or housing or interest rates. We put our heads down and we think about growing our business every single day, somewhat oblivious to what's happening around us. But that stuff matters. So we've invited Dr. Basu here today to provide a little perspective on the economy, what he sees going on, try to make sense of it all. And maybe if you're lucky, you can bait him into telling you a little bit about what he sees on the horizon. So if you're here today, I'm sure you're going to learn something, and knowing Dr. Basu will be entertaining and a bit humorous as well. So I will turn it over to him in a minute. Feel free to ask any questions during the chat. We'll catalog those, and at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. So without further ado, Dr. Basu, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, everyone. Hopefully you can see this and this works without any kind of issue. Looks like it is. And so hopefully you can hear me. All those kinds of things seem to be working. And so let's talk about the economy and where we are in the business cycle and what that means for technology and security solutions and housing starts and all the rest of it. We'll be talking about a lot of that today. My presentation is entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is a Clint Eastwood themed presentation. You'll see that theme throughout the presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it's firmly baked in the cake. I'm going to show you some good today. I'm going to show you some bad, and I'm going to show you some ugly. But I'm going to start with the good. And there's a fair amount of good out there. And macroeconomically, the good might take many forms, but one of them is the fact that we have this current momentum, and the fact that the U.S. economy has continued to expand has been a surprise to many. Many economists were predicting recession for 2023 last year. Let me give you an example. There is a group of economists at Bloomberg, that fabulous business intelligence service. And those economists maintain a forecasting index. And that index was suggesting that the probability of recession in 2023 was 100%. Now, you might know that that's the highest level possible, unless you're talked about the Baltimore Ravens defense, which, as you know, gives 110%. But otherwise, 100% is the max. But we did not fall into recession last year. Indeed, for much of last year, the U.S. economy was gaining momentum. That's the good. The broadest indication of U.S. economic progress is gross domestic product, or growth therein. Where Eagles Dare, by the way, was a 1969 Clint Eastwood film in which he co-starred with Sir Richard Burton. Setting that aside, World War II is the subject matter. But so these are quarterly data, annualized rates of growth. Much of the data I'll show you today are time series data, so the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. The last four bars here are the 4 quarters of 2023. So during the first quarter of 2023, the U.S. economy expands 2.2% on an annualized basis. For the second quarter, 2.1%. So the economy seemed to be slowing. So that's when a lot of the economists said, okay, well, maybe now here comes the recession. Nope. Blockbuster third quarter that no one saw coming, 4.9% growth on an annualized basis. The capstone for the year, that 3.2% performance in the fourth quarter. None of these are indicia of recession. We're not through the first quarter of 2024, of course, but the Atlanta Federal Reserve maintains a product known as GDP Now that estimates current quarter gross domestic product, and that product indicates that during the current quarter, the U.S. economy is on pace to grow 2.1% on an annualized basis. Again, no indication of recession. And of course, there have been certain parts of the economy that have been especially strong, particularly as it relates to the American consumer and their spending. This is monthly retail sales. Monthly data. The last reading here is January of 2024, and admittedly, January was a bit weak. That said, at least relative to December, that said, January spending on retail items was much better than it had been, let's say, pre-pandemic. So you can see that trajectory after the pandemic, the massive increase in consumer spending, and many economists attribute January's performance to weather and other seasonal factors. But the consumer has been spending it. This is a chart that shows you retail items. Actually, much of the growth in consumer outlays has been on services, things like travel. So last year, yes, we set a record for Black Friday sales. We set a record for Cyber Monday, retail goods. But we also set a record for the number of people passing through TSA checkpoints. People are watching Beyonce in concert. They're watching Taylor Swift in concert. In August of 2023, the average Taylor Swift concert ticket purchased on resale, and that's how people buy them on resale, sold for $1,619 per ticket, and she sold out football stadiums in major US cities multiple times. She just toured Sydney, Australia, the 23rd through the 26th of last month, and the leader of the Australian government said she improved our economy. I mean, that's what a phenomenon she is. She moves gross regional product, she moves hotel occupancy, and by the way, is this thing between her and Travis Swift not the greatest? Sorry, Travis Kelce is what I meant to say, of course. Is this thing between her and Travis Kelce not the greatest thing ever? Oh, I think it is. It's fabulous. It's precisely what this nation needed during these troubled times. Not at all annoying. And what you have here is this ruggedly handsome athlete, this three-time Super Bowl winner from the Kansas City Chiefs, Travis Kelce. And he's in a relationship with this savvy singer-songwriter, the quite lovely Taylor Swift. They're in a relationship. There are pictures of them kissing on the internet. Of course, some of that's artificially generated, but the point is it has many Americans a buzz and a glow. And unlike many stories, this was going to end well because it's such a handsome couple. At some point, they're going to produce one very beautiful #1 hit song, because when that breakup occurs, and it will occur, the music is going to flow, and I, for one, cannot wait. Now, later in the presentation, I will show you some data suggesting that the consumer cannot continue on this spending pace, and maybe January's data was a taste of that. But as long as the labor market is strong, the consumer in the aggregate should have the ability to continue to spend, and the labor market is still strong. And that's good and bad news. We'll talk about that. But this is US job openings. So this is the number of available unfilled job openings in America, according to the JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. In December, America home to 9 million available unfilled jobs, a bit less than 500,000 of them in construction. So construction has been one of the most challenged industries in terms of finding workers for various reasons. Now it is true that the number of job openings has fallen, you can see that from the slide, but they remain well above what they were pre-pandemic, when the economy was deemed to be very, very strong. 3.5% rate of unemployment back then. That was a 50-year low. We had 7 million job openings back then, now 9 million job openings. And when you enter each and every month with lots of job openings, what are you going to get? Each and every month, you're going to get addition to job totals. This is monthly job growth in America. December of 2020, which happened to be the last month during which America lost jobs. So that was a COVID-intensive month, pre-vaccination month. We've been adding jobs ever since. In January of 2024, the last bar here, America adds 353,000 jobs. The consensus estimate coming into that release was that America added 185,000 jobs that month. Nope. The figure came in well above estimate, nearly twice that. Unemployment is pinned at 3.7%. Average hourly earnings, so it's a measure of wage growth, up 4.5% year over year. Now we'll talk about that. Why that's good news. It's obvious. Consumers have more money to spend when their wages are rising rapidly. The bad news, of course, is it's inflationary and drives up interest rates, and we'll talk about that too. But set that aside. This is a good part of the presentation. And of course, labor flexed its muscles last year. So, for instance, we had strikes among actors and writers, UAW members. Now, certain negotiations did not end in strikes. Let me give you an example. The negotiations between the Teamsters Union and UPS, United Parcel Service. Those negotiations produced a 5-year contract, and during the 5th year of that contract, the average UPS truck driver will be earning $170,000 per year. That's $170K. Now that's wages plus benefits, but it's $170K, forcing people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? I'm based on the app, spectacular. But the point is, that's inflationary, and we'll talk more about that. Again, in another part of the presentation. But again, if we stick with this consumer spending story, it's very good news. And of course, certain parts of the country have expanded more rapidly than others. And for this audience, I think it matters because you're geographically dispersed across the country. So this is employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. February of 2020 as the baseline. Why that month? That's the last month before we shut down the US economy. So that stands for the pre-pandemic level of employment versus December of 2023, the last month for which you have subnational data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so if you look at the left-hand column, you see the faster growing markets. There's a correlation between population growth and job growth. Those things move in tandem. No region of the country has been adding population faster in absolute terms than Dallas, Texas. Dallas is booming. There's issues with some wildfires, of course, and the Panhandle, so on and so forth. But the Dallas metropolitan area has been just moving ahead very, very quickly. Very attractive, flat land, lots of developable land, lots of rainfall, so on and so forth. And so pretty good for development, supporting larger populations. But by and large, it's the American South that dominates that left-hand column. Tampa, San Antonio, Charlotte, North Carolina, Orlando, Riverside, California, Phoenix, Atlanta, Miami, Houston, the South. Now, Philadelphia sneaks into that left-hand column. Why? During the pandemic, and again, I think this matters for this audience, many people moved from more densely populated, more expensive metropolitan areas to less densely populated, less expensive metropolitan areas. So Philadelphia, don't get me wrong, is dense and expensive, but not compared to New York. So we saw some movement down I-95, including to the Philadelphia suburbs. Riverside, California is on here in part because many people moved from Los Angeles, expensive, to the west, to the east, Riverside, a bit less expensive and a bit less dense. Now, if you look at the right-hand column, you see by and large the Northeast corridor, again, with the exception of Philadelphia, my town of Baltimore, but also New York, Boston Metro, and Washington Metro. Baltimore and Washington have been among the softer growing markets among the 25 largest, as populations move to the south in many cases. So the Carolinas, the Richmond suburbs, so on and so forth. And then you'll see the Midwest, St. Louis, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Detroit. Population growth has tended to be softer in those regions and therefore job growth as well. Now, I find this slide to be quite intriguing. What the next slide is far more important macroeconomically. Same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of employment growth, these are rates of unemployment. And here's the problem. These unemployment rates are too low. Anirban, that's crazy talk, sir. We love low rates of unemployment. We use it as an indication of national economic strength and vigor. Yes, as a general proposition, we like low rates of unemployment. It means job seekers are more likely to find employment quickly. Okay. But it's also inflationary. And because it's hard for employers to find suitable workforce. And that drives up wages. So different reasons for unemployment to be low. So in the Baltimore metropolitan area, unemployment is low, not because the economy has been strong, it hasn't been that strong. It's because many people who have been job seekers, and to be unemployed, you have to be actively looking for work. So when a job seeker moves out of your region, let's say to go to Northern Virginia or the Carolinas, where the job market is hotter and more technology and other jobs are being created, then actually your unemployment rate goes down. Miami, 2.4%. Why? Well, it's very expensive in Miami now. And so if you're unemployed, you probably can't move to Miami to engage in a job search. Those kinds of things. So all kinds of reasons for this. Minneapolis has lost workforce, that kind of thing. So it's been a tough time for Minneapolis these last few years. So again, it's inflationary because to get back to the Federal Reserve's 2% target inflation, we're talking about the Federal Reserve a lot now. To get to their 2% target, that's their measure of price stability, you probably can afford wage growth between 3 and 3.5% a year. We're at 4 to 4.5%. So as long as the labor market continues to perform this way, it means that getting inflation back to 2% is going to be challenging, which means the Federal Reserve is going to have a tough time cutting interest rates, which of course matters to this audience. We'll talk more about the housing market in a moment and real estate generally. But there are some other issues out there that are helping to support higher prices. So let me give you an example, the Red Sea, Panama Canal, like all these shipping costs. And so that brings me to the bad. The question becomes, is it likely that this current economic expansion persists? Now, again, a lot of that has to do with the American consumer. They're 70% of aggregate demand. You can't have a recession as long as the consumer is spending. Now, this is personal savings for you American households. These data come from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So you see personal savings, and then what happens during the pandemic? So what was happening during the pandemic? People started receiving stimulus payments. Many people actually kept their jobs. Wages actually rose rapidly during the pandemic and early stages of recovery. So income was going up for many people. but they weren't going on vacations, not going to restaurants, movie theaters, weren't seeing Beyonce or Taylor Swift or Ice Spice or anything like that. So they're saving lots of money. And according to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco economists, at the pinnacle, they had amassed about $2.1 trillion in excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what they would have saved but for the pandemic. But you can see from the slide, they've mostly spent down those savings. About $1.9 trillion of those savings have been spent down. So they've by and large spent down their pandemic era savings. So increasingly, they're living paycheck to paycheck. And not only are they living paycheck to paycheck, but their paycheck is not stretching as far because prices are rising. It's the consumer price index, 12-month percentage change in prices. So two lines here, that dashed green line is your overall rate of inflation. And what it says is that between January of 2023 and January of 2024, overall inflation running at 3.1%. And you say, Anirban, that's partial victory. Because back in June of 2022, inflation is running at 9.1% year over year. So we've gone from more than 9% inflation to around 3%. Now, it is true that a meaningful fraction of the decline in inflation has been attributable to falling food and energy prices. So last year, for instance, egg prices fell after the avian flu drove prices higher in 2022. Natural gas is well below $2 per million BTU, and actually during a recent month fell about 50% in price. And oil prices, despite all the madness and mayhem around the world, remains a bit below $80 a barrel. So when, for instance, Hamas made its move on Israel on October 7th of last year, oil was trading in the mid 80s, now in the high 70s. If you strip out food and energy prices, therefore, you get a higher measure of inflation. That's that dark blue line, all items as food and energy, otherwise known as the core inflation rate, and that's running at 3.9%. It's improved. You can see that from the chart. But in either instance, inflation remains above the Federal Reserve's 2% target. Now, the Federal Reserve actually has a measure of inflation that it prefers to these. It's called the core PCE deflator, the core personal consumption expenditure deflator. Those data came out last week indicating that, according to that measure, inflation year over year is running at around 2.8%. But anyway you slice it, inflation is above 2%. Though we got a number this morning from the Institute for Supply Management indicating that service sector inflation is beginning to dip. And that's why, if you're looking at the interest rates today, interest rates have been falling, or certain interest rates have been falling for much of this morning. But again, getting back to the consumer, high and rising prices. Let me break this down for you. This is the year over year percentage change in consumer prices. Again, January of 2023 versus January of 2024. You look toward the bottom of the slide, you can see the headline numbers here. 3.1% overall inflation, 3.9% on the core, all items as food and energy. But if you look categorically at these green colored bars, you still see some fairly chunky rates of inflation. Transportation services, 9.5%. Well, of course, UPS truck drivers making more. So transportation services, freight services, that kind of thing, more expensive. You can see things like shelter, that includes your apartment rents, up 6%. We'll talk about the multifamily marketplace in a moment. And the effect of this is cumulative. So we economists say, oh, inflation's falling. Yeah, we love to say that. But prices are still rising. That the rate at which prices are rising has been falling, but prices are still rising. And the effect of this on consumers is cumulative. So if you look at the consumer price index again, third time, but now I'm using May of 2020 as the baseline month. Why that month? That's the first month of the economic recovery. So America loses $22 million in March and April of 2020. We start to add back jobs in May of 2020. The recession is officially over by this point. It ended in April of 2020. So if you compare prices as they were back then and compare those to January of 2024 prices, January's last month for each of these data, again, toward the bottom, you can see the headline numbers, overall inflation 20% in about 3.5 years in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum. Strip out food and energy prices, still lofty 18%, despite the recent dip in energy prices recently, you can see energy prices up 48%. Over this period, transportation services 39%, used car and truck prices up 30%. Right, so new vehicle prices up 21%, tobacco and smoking product prices up 29%. So one of the worst things you can do is smoke in a new car because that destroys the new car smell, is not very good for your health, but also renders one susceptible to a lot of this inflation. But there's lots of inflation here. Shelter costs up 21%. That's about a third of the consumer price index. So again, the consumers spent through their pandemic era savings. They're facing high and still rising prices. So what do to maintain their living standards? They turn to their credit cards. This is U.S. credit card debt, and it is spiking. And previous rounds of credit card debt spikes have been associated with economic downturns, 07, 08, 09, and also the early stages of the pandemic, early 2020. According to the New York Federal Reserve economists, total outstanding U.S. credit card debt now $1.13 trillion. And of course, having spent through those pandemic era savings, more and more Americans are having a tough time dealing with that credit card debt. Delinquencies have risen. This is the percentage of balances 30 plus days delinquent by loan type. So if you look at that green line there, that's credit card delinquency, and it's rising. Now, some economists would say, look, yeah, credit card delinquency is rising, that's true, but it's low relative to history. It's rising off a very low level of delinquency. So don't get so worried about it. And that's the optimistic view. But that's not me. I am one of the most pessimistic people you will ever encounter. Did not have a girlfriend in high school, didn't have one in college. I'm from Baltimore. I'm always expecting bad things to happen. And so I think the trend is ominous. And it's not alone, by the way. The yellow line is auto loan debt. That's starting to rise. Of course, one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is that many people had to turn to buying very expensive used cars and took on debt to buy those very expensive used cars. And now some of them apparently are struggling to pay down that debt on a timely basis. A mortgage debt is in brown. Even there, we see some increase in delinquency. The only category here that we don't see that is HELOCs, that's your home equity lines of credit. Now, what do we know about people with HELOCs? One, they have a mortgage, and two, they have equity in their homes. So that gives you a different slice of American demography. But nonetheless, not great news. And of course, in many cases, this is high interest debt that's delinquent. So this is commercial bank interest rates on credit card plans. And you can see interest rates on credit cards have spiked. So what would an economist have thought? I mean, let's take a step back. I was taught in school that the most important price is the interest rate, the price of money, the price to access money. So when I see the interest rate take off like this, what do I expect to have happen? Consumers are going to take on less credit card debt. I'm going to respond to that impetus, that impulse. But instead, consumers spent right through it, which has been great for retail sales and services spending, probably great for Taylor Swift, but not great if we want the recovery to be sustained, because now more and more consumers are having difficulty. And this, of course, would impact spending on things like security solutions as well, at least for some Americans. I mean, also we have enormous concentrations of wealth in this country. So I'm not talking about the top 1% or 10% or 20%. They're fine. They're looking at a Dow Jones that's been at 39,000. It's down today, as it turns out, by more than 200 points. But near 39,000, an SP that's been above 5,000, setting records. They're doing fine. If they own Bitcoin, my goodness, forget about it. But the point is, for many Americans living paycheck to paycheck, high and rising prices turn into credit card delinquency. That suggests that, at least for some Americans, purchases are going to slow down. And here's another thing. Many Americans play this game. What's the game? Okay, yeah, I've maxed out this credit card. No problem. I'll just get another credit card. I'll just transfer my balances from this credit card to that new one, and I'll pay that low introductory rate. And then I'll work up the balances on the next credit card. Except here's the problem. This is the net percentage of domestic banks tightening standards for credit card loans. So it's the percentage of domestic banks tightening standards saying, no, you will not have a new credit card from us, our bank, minus a proportion that are loosening standards. Okay, fine. And you can see the numbers well above 0%, which means more banks are tightening their standards, saying, no, we will not issue a new credit card. You need to deal with the debt you're dealing with right now. Not dealing with right now. So, and by the way, this has been engineered. So there was a group of policymakers in Washington who wanted to tighten credit conditions. They wanted to drive up interest rates. Not criticizing that, I'm just telling you that was their intention. And who is that? That is the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, in particular the Federal Open Market Committee that sets certain key interest rates. So the principal instrument that the Federal Reserve has to control economic growth or shape economic growth and its byproduct of inflation is the Fed funds rate, federal funds rate, otherwise known as the overnight bank lending rate. This is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another overnight to shore up their reserves. And why would a bank do that? Because a bank needs a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of it, and occasionally banks run up against that constraint. Now, when this rate is set at a low level, banks are more likely to borrow from one another, thereby shoring up their reserves, thereby lending more aggressively in the economy. When this interest rate is high, banks are less likely to do that, borrow money to shore up the reserves, and therefore less likely to lend money in the economy. And this is, again, the principal mechanism by which the Federal Reserve influences economic growth, and again, that byproduct of inflation. Now, the surge of excess inflation, meaning inflation above the 2% target, begins during the spring of 2021. That's when demand is for goods and services surging, coming out of the pandemic, but supply chains have been short to varying degrees. Workers had yet to be fully rehired, and so supply was falling short of demand. Scarcity in the economy, prices took off. Now, in 2021, the Federal Reserve doesn't do anything about it. They think it's merely transitory. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. They think it's simply supply chain driven. That as supply chains normalize, as workers are rehired, supply will rise up to meet demand, and inflation just naturally abate to that 2% level we'd enjoyed for many years prior to the pandemic. Instead, what the Federal Reserve appears to have done is to preside over the creation of a wage price spiral, and we're still living with it. Quite rapid wage growth in many segments of the economy. Now, they start to make their move in 2022. March 16th of 2022, they start to raise rates. But even then, only dipping their toes in the inflation fighting waters, that day raising rates 0.25%. But then the next meeting, 0.5%. Next 4 meetings consecutively, 0.75% each meeting. Then back to 0.5%, then 0.25%, then 0.25%. May 3rd of last year, 0.25%, pause in June. July 26th, 0.25%, pause thereafter. That means that this interest rate, the upper limit on the Fed funds target rate, has gone from 0.25% to 5.5%. And there's been a lot of discussion about when they're going to start cutting rates. What's the problem? Inflation, wage pressure, supply chain issues still out there. And so it's limited their ability to cut rates. There had been a lot of chatter several weeks ago that they're going to start cutting rates this month, March. No more chatter about that. Now maybe it's May, June, July, and maybe only once or twice this year. Maybe more than that, we'll see. But the point is, interest rates are set to stay higher for longer because we've got this stubborn inflation. And, many economists go, well, okay, fine, whatever. But this economy has already shown the ability to navigate higher interest rates. So as long as interest rates are getting higher, we don't have a problem here. Here's my feeling. We still might have a problem. So we might. So I won't go through all of this, but I want to go through this first bullet. It's a quote from Raphael Bostic, the highly regarded president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve, who says, quote, "A large body of research tells us it can take 18 months to 2 years or more for tighter monetary policy to materially affect inflation." And you say to me, Anirban, nonsense. You might say he's highly regarded, but that is sheer nonsense. Because you yourself just said the Federal Reserve has been raising rates since March of 2022, and that over an overlapping period, inflation fell from 9% to around 3%. And less than that if you look at other measures of inflation. Fair enough. But here's my feeling, and here's my thesis. And to the extent that you disagree with my thesis, my logic, your outlook will differ from mine, and that's just fine. I will give you my forecast for the economy later on in this presentation, but this is not about you buying into my forecast. I'm agnostic with respect to that. My goal today is to do some issue spotting on your behalf so you can refine your own views on the economy, your own forecasts or projections for the economy, and determine what that means for your various stakeholders, your enterprise, your customers, so on and so forth. So my view is that the reason the economy has behaved the way it has over the past 2 years is because supply chains are better than they were, let's say in late 2021. Now, I'm not saying they're perfect. I'll just mention that. Anytime I speak to a group of mechanical contractors, for instance, they're quick to remind me about their lengthy lead times for switchgear and generators. Fair enough. But they're more reliable, these supply chains, than they were in late 2021. And here's what happens as supply chains improve in the context of unmet demand. Let's take new cars as an example. So for a while, the Americans could not find new cars on dealership lots. So what did they do? They bought used cars. What happened to the prices of used cars? They skyrocketed. But then, eventually, new cars began to show up on dealership lots. So all of a sudden, Americans now had optionality. All of a sudden, used car prices were not rising so rapidly. But moreover, because there was this frenzied unmet demand for these new cars, lots of transactional volume. Those cars flew off the dealership lots. So what do you get as supply chains improve in the context of unmet demand? You get lots of transactional volume as that supply meets ready, awaiting demand. And you get less inflation because there's less scarcity in the economy. And that's what we've seen. Economic growth, less inflation. My view is that some of the impacts of these higher interest rates have yet to fully permeate the economy. And that's sort of the risk here, these lag effects about which Raphael Bostic and others have spoken. So let's talk about another set of interest rates in a market of great interest to this audience, the housing market. So two interest rates of interest. The 50-year fixed mortgage rate is in green. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate is in blue. These data come from Freddie Mac. Now, according to the most recent weekly data, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate in America, 6.94%. If you look at the Mortgage Bankers Association, they'll tell you it's recently risen above 7%. Now, some of us will say, well, that's not high. I remember mortgage rates were 18% or 15%. I got a deal at 8%. Fair enough. But to millennials and Generation Z, the youngest members of our workforce, these rates are preposterously high. And that's who's really subtracted themselves from the home purchasing marketplace. It's been that would-be first-time buyer, frustrated by a lack of inventory, by high prices, and now by their standards, extremely high borrowing costs. So as I move toward the tail end of this presentation, I want to leave, about 15 minutes for Q&A. So just give me another 15 minutes or so. I'm going to, or another 10 minutes or so. I'm going to show you some leading economic indicators because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been happening to a discussion of what's likely to happen going forward. So let's start with this one. This is the U.S. Mortgage Loan Applications Composite Index. Why is this a leading indicator? Because often the purchase process begins with a mortgage application. This represents someone's intention to get to a settlement table downstream. But they need to get that mortgage first to be taken seriously as a buyer. Now, if you look here at this index, mortgage applications are down about 78% from their 2021 peak. So the number of buyers out there, would-be near-term buyers, has really dried up. So you say, oh my goodness, Anirban, 78%. The housing market must be in terrible, terrible shape. But from a new construction perspective, it's actually not. Why is that? Well, because there's still support for high prices. This is the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index. And yes, if you look at the end of the series, you can see some emerging weakness in home prices. But you see during the pandemic and early stages of recovery, that big vertical sweep, that's a 45% increase in home sales prices nationwide. And of course, during the pandemic, behavior changed. We want more house. We're spending more time at home, so we want more square footage. We want room for home offices and home gyms. We want one room just for the Peloton. I mean, anytime you see a Peloton commercial, it is the only piece of furniture in that room. And we want to take advantage of the lowest mortgage rates in the history of this country. But then, of course, pandemic ended, and mortgage rates took off. So I thought, well, we're probably going to give back a significant fraction of that 45% gain. And you can see for several months, prices were trending lower. Didn't stay that long. Why? Yes, we don't have as many buyers as we had once upon a time. That's true. We also don't have many sellers. Because if you're sitting in Hagerstown, Maryland, or Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Kankakee, Illinois, or Riverside, California, with a 2.75% 30-year fix, where are you going? You're not going anywhere. You don't have to be carted out of that house. You don't leave that house in an ambulance. And so we've got this lock-in effect. Not many buyers, not many sellers, and so an equilibrium of, still quite high prices. Now, this, of course, affects housing starts. So this is U.S. housing starts. And you look at this, you say, oh, that doesn't look so great. It does not actually look so terrible. Housing starts. Now you say, if you look at that period 2005, 2006, that sort of the boom in home construction, the housing bubble, strip that out. And then just look at the series overall. And you say, oh, housing unit started actually looks kind of average over time. It doesn't look so bad. Well, how is this? If we have fewer buyers out there, why are there so many housing starts? Because there are so few existing homes for sale that new home builders are finding opportunities to serve unmet demand, including among the wealthy, by the way, because it's the wealthy who are not so worried about mortgage rates. 6.9% on 30-year fixed mortgage rate, I have to pay 15. I can afford that. Or I'm going to buy this house all cash anyway, so I don't even worry about borrowing costs. This is, by the way, new single-family homes sold. It tells the same story. So, you can see that peak in home sales back in 04, 05, 06, that housing bubble, and then the burst of the housing bubble. But if you look at the long-term average here, January of 2024's annualized rate doesn't look so different from long-term history, the average. So the new housing market has actually held up quite well. You can see that on this slide as well. This is another leading indicator. It's U.S. residential building permits. That's a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull permits before you build. And where do you see the momentum here? Is that orange line there? That's single family. Anirban, how's that possible? You just said mortgage applications are down. Again, because there are not many existing single family homes for sale, people have to look for other options, and that means new construction. So new builders still spying opportunities. I'm not saying it's a great market, by the way. I'm just saying it's not abysmal. And oddly enough, where we see loss of momentum is in that green line. That's multifamily. That includes prospective apartment construction. Now, don't get me wrong. We've had a lot of apartment construction in this country in recent years. That's true. And leasing activity still remains strong. Why? Because the millennials, our most populous generation, can't find homes that they can afford in many cases. So they have to be renters unless they live with their parents. So, Anirban, if the millennials, our most populous generation, are having a tough time finding a home and they're renting apartments, I would think multifamily building permits would be strong. Leasing activity is strong. Why do we see that dip? Why? Because increasingly developers are having a tough time lining up their project financing. Banks and other lenders don't want to be so exposed to real estate right now. You'll remember that about a year ago, March 10th of 2023, we suffered the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, then Signature Bank. Then we had the issues at First Republic, which was taken up by JP Morgan, all those things. Happened about a year ago. So since that time, regulators have scrutinized bank balance sheets more aggressively. Bankers are more defensive in terms of their lending, don't want to take on as much risk. And real estate is viewed as risky under current circumstances. And this extends beyond the multifamily or the apartment construction segment. It's your architecture billings index. So you see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide. Any reading less than 50 means that architects are less busy now than they were the previous month. And if you look at the end of the series here, last 6 months, architects have been getting less and less busy. Why is that? My view, project finance is more difficult to obtain. And if I'm a developer and I can't line my project financing, or maybe I can line it up, but the interest rate is so high, my cost of capital is so high, my pro forma no longer works out, what do I need an architect for? I don't need you billing me right now. I can't move forward with this project in any case. And of course, that would tend to affect new construction. So let's talk about the ugly, which is the office market. That's the ugliest part of this economy right now, in my view. If you have another one, we can talk about during Q&A in just a few minutes. Now, last year, the US economy grew around 2.5%. We added hundreds of thousands of jobs in office space using categories, and yet the office vacancy rate went up. So this is overall office vacancy. These are CoStar data. And that 13.7% that you see at the end of the series, that's a lie. Way more than 13.7% of our nation's office space is vacant, but it is not deemed to be vacant because it is still leased. But as these lease renewals continue to come up, that's going to push office vacancy higher in many, many communities. And on top of that, we have this debt maturity wall. What does that mean? That a lot of the debt that people who own office buildings have has to be refinanced over the next few years. So this is commercial real estate debt maturities. $2.5 trillion in the next 5 years has to be refinanced. Who's going to refinance it? Banks don't want to be so exposed to this real estate. A lot of this is office market related debt. So that's a problem because right now they might be holding that building at 6% interest, but their interest rate could become 13, 14, 50%. And now that building is already not cash flowing, leases may not be renewing. And by the way, it's not everywhere that we have these office market issues. In many cases, suburban office markets are in pretty good shape. It's really those historic central business districts, those downtowns, where we see the most vacancy and the most problems. In some cases, my guess is building owners are going to take the keys to the building and just throw them to the bankers. Say, here, you take it, because I owe you more than the building is now worth. And the bankers will say, hold up, let's talk about it. But that's going to cause some distress. Now, if you play the long game here, there's good news here. Because what this means is that a lot of property is going to change hands. And often when property changes hands, that's when improvements are made to the property, including security systems, for instance. So the short term might be a bit volatile, but the longer term outlook actually is quite good if you think about adaptive reuse and those kinds of things, and the need for security solutions. Now, these are downtown office vacancy rates. So the vacancy rate I showed you earlier was the overall vacancy rate. This is just downtowns. So you can see in certain markets, San Francisco, 36%. Wilmington, Delaware, which is a financial services center, but lots of consolidation in that financial services center sector recently. In Wilmington, 34%. Denver, 32%, so on and so forth. So this, again, frustrates new construction, but it is going to trigger a lot of changing of hands of property, and ultimately that translates into more investment going forward. Okay, enough of that. Let's go to the forecast. So this is a line from the Dirty Harry films. There are 5 Dirty Harry films. This is him as Dirty Harry. Dirty Harry. The first film actually came out in 1971 and was entitled Dirty Harry. In that movie, he has a partner, as it turns out, unwillingly, but he has a partner. The character's name is Chico Gonzalez. Chico Gonzalez. The actor who played Chico Gonzalez would later show up in the Seinfeld episodes playing the part of Poppy, the unhygienic restaurateur. In any case, let's talk about some more leading economic indicators. The consumer. We all care about the consumer. By some measures, 70% of the economy. What's going on with the consumer? Well, you can see they're less unhappy. They're not happy. I mean, Americans are not happy, right? I mean, people ask me all the time, why do Americans drive angry, Anirban? Because they're angry. They do everything angry. You just see them when they're driving. But they've been happy about, or happier than they had been about, lower inflation, the fact that we haven't had recession, the job market's been strong, they've seen healthy wage growth, they're in demand. They feel pretty secure in their jobs. They feel pretty secure in their jobs. They're told that they're needed and wanted, and they are. But if you look at this consumer sentiment measure, it's about where we were back in, let's say, years like 2011, 2012, which are mediocre years for the economy, but not recession years. Not recession years, those are years of recovery. We also see some confidence among small business owners. So this is the National Federation of Independent Businesses Index of Small Business Optimism. Question, Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? In January, 8% said yes, which is not high. It's actually akin to what we saw in 08, 09 during the financial crisis, but it's higher than it was. A few months ago, it was 2%. So we are seeing more confidence in the economy. The economy is still growing with lots of job openings. Unemployment is low. Consumers are spending. Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift are still dating. And so many economists would just stop the press station right there and say, hey, drive home safely, everyone. Thanks a lot. But that's not me, because I'm a pessimist. I'm from Baltimore. I'm a Ravens fan. So I'm going to keep going and show you a couple more leading indicators like this one. This is the Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators. It's actually 10 leading indicators in its own right, all bundled into one composite index being graphed for you here. And it's telling us something more wicked this way comes. The economy could face some more challenges going forward. And again, part of that is probably those lag effects for those higher interest rates. So those interest rates take time to have an impact on the economy. And my thing is there's more impact to come. Here's another thing. The yield curve. It's inverted. So 2 interest rates, again, of interest. The yield on the 1-year treasury is in green. The yield or the interest rate on the 10-year treasury is in blue. Now, typically, you would expect the yield or the interest rate on a 10-year instrument to be meaningfully above that relative to a 1-year. When you buy a 10-year U.S. treasury, you are lending to the federal government. You're lending to the federal government for a decade. You're not going to see your principal for 10 years, assuming you hold that bond to maturity. And therefore, you're becoming highly illiquid. You're being very patient. You're going to demand higher interest from the marketplace to reward you for your illiquidity. By contrast, when you buy a 1-year U.S. treasury, you're going to see your principal back in 12 months risk-free. You're not being so patient, not being so highly illiquid. Therefore, you're not going to demand as much interest from the marketplace. But occasionally, the bond market goes topsy-turvy, upside down, inside out, Diana Ross, and the yield on the 1-year in green goes above the yield on the 10-year in blue. Now, these gray shaded areas are periods of recession dating back several decades. So when do you see that green line, the interest rate on the 10-year, the interest rate on the 1-year, the interest rate on the 1-year, the green line, go above the blue line, the interest rate on the 10-year, just before the 1970 recession, before 73, 74, 75, before 1980, before the 81, 82 episode, before 1990, 1991, before 2001, before 07, 08, 09, not so much before 2020. That was caused something else, but now we've got this inversion. So as I'm speaking to you, the yield on the 10-year, 4.15%, the yield on the 1-year, 4.96%, inversion. Has been nearly a flawless predictor of recession for decades. And I say, Anirban, I don't want a recession. Maybe you do. Maybe you do. Brings me to my final slide. Why is that? Because if we have some economic weakness, interest rates will come down faster, and that means the housing market will come back more strongly. We're right now stuck with these high interest rates because of high inflation, but a recession would cause inflation to come down. Prices would actually fall in some cases. Interest rates come down, and then we're off to the races once again. Go where you're looking and look where you're going is a line out of the 2021 film Prime Macho. not a box office sensation, but a critically acclaimed film. This is a movie that Clint Eastwood acted in, but also directed and produced and danced in. He's born in 1930, so when this movie opened up, he's 91 years old and he is still doing it. It is pretty impressive. We are a deeply in debt society currently facing high borrowing costs, and that's what makes me pessimistic regarding the near-term outlook. Geopolitics and federal elections don't help. Obviously, got lots of issues. North Koreans lobbing missiles all over the place, and Russians invading people, and all this, all these things happen in the Middle East, and the Red Sea, and the Panama Canal, and all these things. And then we've got federal elections this year, and sometimes people take a wait and see attitude during years of presidential elections. So they don't want to make any big decisions, even small decisions. Honey, we need a water heater. Let's see how Trump does, shall we? Before we make any big commitments, or Biden or whomever. So that's a source of additional concern, distraction, and risk. So my view is this: it will come nearly a year after I initially anticipated, but recession is coming in 2024, very late this year if it comes. Now I'm in the minority now. Only about 25% of economists think a recession is coming in the next year. So I'm very much in the minority. I'm a pessimist. Most economists you talk to say soft landing, we're fine, we're going to be fine, the economy's going to be fine. But in some sense, that's bad news. Because if the economy doesn't start to stutter, doesn't start to sputter, then of course interest rates stay higher for longer. And I don't think anyone in the audience really wants that. If you like this kind of data analysis, I have a newsletter at www.sagecon.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not necessarily dying for dollars. If you're not interested in the newsletter, please, anytime feel free to go ahead and pound sand. And with that, hey, thanks a lot for the opportunity. It's been a privilege. Let us turn to Q&A. And at this moment in economic history, I will stop sharing. So thanks a lot for the opportunity, everyone, to be with you today. I hope you got something out of this.
Thank you, Anirban. Everyone, there is a Q&A section. If you want to hop in there and drop me a couple of questions, I will kick it off, and as they roll in, I will ask. I want to take you back in time just a minute to sort of the end of the 1970s, the Great Inflation. So, we came out of the Great Inflation in 1982, and we were 2 years into the Reaganomics era. Some people would say what snapped us out of that was the surprise 1983 World Series win from the Baltimore Orioles, who I predict will win it again this year. Other people would argue it was just good old classical, Federal Reserve getting the economy under control. Do you see this going back to a period of volatility like the 1970s where we were sort of up and down? Or do you think we just sort of need to hit the reset button, get consumer balance sheets back where they need to be, and we'll be set for another 10 or 15 years of sort of slow inclination?
Yeah, a couple of things to unpack there. So, it'd be nice to have Cal Ripken back in his 20s. Obviously, that helped. But so there had been a chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1970 to 1978. Arthur Burns was his name. And he was dealing with the oil embargoes in the 1970s, some other inflationary forces. And so what would happen to the Federal Reserve is they would, see inflation, they'd raise interest rates, inflation would come down, then they would stop raising interest rates, inflation would snap right back up. And it wasn't until the Federal Reserve chairmanship of Paul Volcker that we finally saw inflation stomped out. But it took two major recessions to have that happen. It's a double dip recession in the early 1980s, and very deep recessions, by the way. Americans suffered a lot during that period. But that's what allowed interest rates to come down because inflation came down for many decades. And that led to a blossoming of prosperity during the 80s, commercial real estate boom, 90s, technology boom, 2000s, housing boom, so on and so forth. And now again, we're in the midst of a technology boom. So great. Now, here's the issue with the Federal Reserve. They learned the lessons of the 1970s, and they don't want to be too quick to reduce rates because they're nervous that inflation is going to pop back up. And so that's why interest rates must stay higher for longer. Now, with respect to the long-term economic outlook, look, we Americans can be a pretty grumpy lot. But look what's happened here. This is a country that was dependent on OPEC nations for oil many years ago. Now, you might remember 1973, the first oil embargo brought America to its knees, long gas lines, so on and so forth. By 2009, we're producing less than 4 million barrels of oil per day. You know how much we produce now? More than 13 million barrels of oil per day. We are the world's leading natural gas producer. And now we're seeing supply chain come back home. $250 billion of computer chip manufacturing plants are developed in this country, $40 billion of battery manufacturing plants are developed in this country. That's Intel, TSMC, Texas Instruments, Micron, others, massive investments. So all of a sudden, we're becoming more industrially muscular. And then, of course, we're the leaders in artificial intelligence, and tend to be, we just landed on the moon once again. And there's some evidence that we're seeing a productivity boom in this country because, the pandemic unleashed that. So now we order at restaurants using barcodes. Well, if I'm a server, I can now serve 5 tables instead of 4. That's a big increase in productivity, that kind of thing. So you put all that together, and America could be ready for a long run. 10, 15 years is possible. It'll be our century again. The one caveat to that is this. It is the lack of fiscal discipline in Washington, D.C. The national debt is now above $34.2 trillion. Last I checked the debt clock. Social Security goes insolvent in 2033, according to the most recent trustees report. The Medicare Trust Fund goes insolvent in 2031. If we don't bankrupt ourselves first, we're off to the races, demographically and otherwise, technologically. But we've got that ticking time bomb there, that national debt, that causes me great concern for the next decade. But if we can solve those issues, if we can have better people in Washington, D.C., I understand why we send our worst Americans to Washington, D.C., by the way. Say you don't like your neighbor. Hey, why don't you run for Congress? I get it. But it doesn't lead to good policymaking. So if we can get higher quality policymaking in Washington, D.C., watch out. America's going to go on a massive run. And we're the only ones that can do that.
So from the audience, tell us a little bit about how the demographics of the baby boom generation plays. I mean, we've seen how demographics can really impact the cycles in other parts of the world, such as China. It's a big generation. They've got a lot of the wealth. They're starting to age. How does that play into your forecasting the economy in the next 10 or 15 years?
Yeah, it's a big generation, but it's no longer the biggest, as it turns out, because we've now had enough death in that generation that is now smaller than the millennial generation. The millennials are by and large their children. And you've probably read the trillions of dollars that are going to be handed over in the next few years from baby boomers to millennials. So all of a sudden, millennials are going to receive significant monies from those parents, those families. And at a time when they're their peak spending years, right? They're forming families, purchasing homes for the first time, or upgrading, whatever it happens to be. So that's quite positive. I mean, and the reason it's positive is because the baby boomers were so successful as a generation. And the baby boomers were unbelievable. I mean, it didn't start out that way. Flowers in their hair and minivans and free love and psychedelic drugs and all the rest of it in Woodstock. But then they become very corporate very quickly in the 1980s and 1990s. They've done very, very well for themselves, and they have a lot of wealth to pass on to younger families. So, death is not positive, of course, but inheriting wealth, I guess, is. And so we're going to see a lot of that transfer of wealth going forward, and that should actually be good for the economy because these millennials are ready to spend that money because they're in that part of their life to spend money, including on their children.
Okay. So I want to bring up the B word for a second, bubble. I mean, and most people most closely associate that with the stock market, but it can really affect any asset. I mean, if we look across the spectrum, the premium people are expecting for a risk-adjusted return right now is at an all-time low. It just seems like the market is not pricing in risk. They've really priced everything to perfection. That has a lot of people scared that asset prices have to come backwards pretty substantially. Where do you, I mean, I know all assets are different, but when you throw them in a bucket, do you believe assets are out over their skis a little bit?
Oh, I think so. I mean, last year, for instance, the equity markets did very well, didn't they? Yes, they did. But it's not because corporate earnings were up significantly. No. I mean, you take out the big 7, their corporate earnings were up massively. NVIDIA, so on, those kinds of companies. But you take those companies out, the big 7, the magnificent 7, and corporate earnings didn't do very much. But still, the markets went higher. Why? It's because of multiple expansion. Price earnings ratio went up. We're willing to pay more for a bucket of earnings. And you would think, based on that, the world must be in great shape, that we don't have this war in Ukraine, that we don't have Vladimir Putin threatening people with nuclear weaponry if NATO puts feet on the ground, for instance, in Ukraine, that kind of thing, that we don't have a North Korea hacking and so on and so forth, and threatening nuclear launches, that we don't have a conflict now between the Iranians and the Pakistanis, a would-be nuclear power and a nuclear power, that kind of thing. Or the Red Sea, or all these kinds of things that are happening, or China and Taiwan. So, you put all this together, and I say, yes, I think the market is underpricing risk. And for me to be right about there being a recession, I would need the markets to come down. I'm not saying I want that, by the way. I'm an investor too, but I would need the markets to come down off these very lofty levels. Because otherwise, the market's creating so much wealth. And again, today is an exception. The market is down pretty meaningfully today. But I think the NASDAQ is down 1.5% today. But again, with all that wealth being created by the equity markets, that keeps spending power, at least among some Americans. So I think you might be onto something. The valuations are ahead of their skis. I think Bitcoin also, by the way, could, it's going up right now. I understand that record high and all those kinds of things, these new ETFs, but at some point you could see a real crash there too.
Yeah, I feel a little bit like we're in that mania phase, which is sort of the last gasp of freedom before you eventually have to pay the piper. And the fact that most economists think we're going to have a soft landing almost speaks to me more loudly than anything that, of course, we're not going to have a soft landing.
That is very contrary to you. I think you're right, though.
Well, I'm happy to have you here today. For those of you involved, we're going to have Anirban back later in the year. So he's got to actually defend all of these predictions that he's made. And I encourage you to come. I think it's really beholden on us. We're experts at our craft, but we have to take a broader look at the world around us because we cannot be successful in a vacuum. And while you can make a lot of money in a rising economy, you can make far more in one that's declining if you're properly positioned. So I think as we sum this up, there's some dark clouds ahead, and you need to batten down the hatches a little bit and start making a plan B because things could turn on us and we can still be successful, but we have to be prepared. So looking down the road a little bit, probably a little bit more negative than positive. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so in the short term, but in the longer term, based on American demographics, the desire of millennials, our large generation, to buy homes, to start families, I mean, that's really great for security solutions, right? Because at the same time, we have all this concern in our society about crime, right? 24/7 news service, all those kinds of things, Fox News, whatever it happens to be, showing criminality all over the place all the time, and people want to be safe in their homes. So once we get through this part of the cycle, this high interest rate part of the cycle, again, we're in for a run. And if Washington, D.C. can be disciplined, if we can have some good policymaking out of Congress, then watch out. The Chinese, the Europeans, nobody's going to be able to keep up with us. America's going to go on a tear relative to the rest of the world. So I think that's possible.
Well, I never bet on politics. That's a fool's errand. And with that, I think we'll leave it here. This was a great presentation. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you in 5 or 6 more months.
All right. Hopefully you forget what I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.